Going live. All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, tonight to our discussion here with Decoding Dyslexia Florida. I'm Joy Props, and I am so excited to be joined tonight with Dr. Kelly Farquharson. She is a speech-language pathologist and an associate professor at Florida State University. She's also the director of the Children's Literacy and Speech Sound Lab, also known as CLASS, there at FSU. And she has advocated for children with dyslexia across the country, and we're really excited that she's joining us on the Decoding Dyslexia Florida Steering Committee. So tonight she's going to be talking to us about the speech-language connection of dyslexia. We are also going to have a time after her presentation for live Q&A. So we would love to have you participate with us tonight on Facebook Live. If you could start by just typing a message on Facebook to let us know your background. Are you a parent? Are you an educator? Are you an SLP? Are you an advocate? Are you a mix of all of the above? Just let us know, and that can kind of help Dr. Farquharson as she is going through her presentation tonight and answering your questions, make it more tailored for your needs. So feel free to drop questions as we go through, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can after the presentation. Thank you so much, and without further ado, here is Dr. Farquharson.
Thank you so much, Joy. I'm so happy to be here, and I'm thankful for your introduction. I am an associate professor at Florida State University, as Joy indicated, and I'm excited to be here tonight to talk to you about dyslexia and the connection between it and speech and language disorders and impairments. And so we don't have a lot of time together, so I thought I might just really kind of do kind of a 30-minute overview of these constructs, thinking about dyslexia and then speech and language, review some of the research. I do have one activity that you can participate in towards the end. And then there's lots of time for questions and answers, because I know how perplexing this can be to think about the connection between dyslexia and speech and language disorders, particularly if you're a parent, but even for service providers, it's sometimes confusing to figure out, what kind of disorder are we actually talking about here, and how do we really determine what is going to be the most influential source of treatment for a particular child. So I'm hoping that the time for Q&A is beneficial for you. So I'll just go ahead and get started. I do have a second screen here, which is where I'm projecting. So I apologize that I'll be switching my attention back and forth. But so I am, as Joy mentioned, I direct the Children's Literacy and Speech Sound or CLASS Lab at FSU. And I have the website listed there. So it's classlab.cci.fsu.edu. And that website, that's my lab website. So there's lots of resources on there for you. But if you click on the resources tab, you can get a PDF of the PowerPoint for tonight. So that's available there for you. You can just click there and find that. I'm active on social media, so I like to share research opportunities, research outcomes. And so on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, there's ways to reach me. And then my email also is available there. So even though you are accessing this presentation tonight through the Decoding Dyslexia Florida page, I thought it would still be helpful for us to make sure that we talk about some definitions and think about what dyslexia is. And I always include a few slides on what dyslexia is not, because as we know of people who are interested in dyslexia or support kids in whatever way who have dyslexia, we know that there's a lot of misconceptions. And so dyslexia is a language-based, sorry, let me get my clicker over here, a language-based word reading deficit, and it's neurobiological in nature. And so what that basically means is that you are born with dyslexia. This is not something that you get later on in life, and it is not the result of poor reading instruction or environmental factors. So it is neurobiological. There is a genetic component, so we do know that it runs in families, but if you have dyslexia, it's something that you were born with. There's nothing that a parent could have done differently to change that trajectory. And so then as a result, it is usually experienced for life. That does not mean that it's a life sentence. So it does not mean that a person will never be able to read. And we know quite the contrary is true, that there are a lot of supports for children and adults who have dyslexia. The important part is to make sure that we identify it early and provide preventative services as well as early intervening services. And those preventative services are not going to prevent dyslexia because it is neurobiological, so it's already there, but it will help to curtail some of the symptoms and importantly, hopefully result in better academic outcomes for children. So this does also exist along a spectrum. We can see a wide variety of severities in dyslexia. It can be a mild presentation all the way through a fairly severe presentation. And it is the most common learning disability. And so if you're familiar with the Decoding Dyslexia mission and efforts, you know that one of our hashtags is Say Dyslexia. And so we have really pushed that agenda across the country to make sure that families and practitioners feel comfortable saying dyslexia, because one of the biggest issues is that it's not a term that's used in schools a lot of the time. And as a result, a lot of educators don't feel prepared to assess or treat dyslexia. But it is the most common learning disability. So we should be working together to think about ways that we can provide earlier identification and earlier intervening services. So you're probably familiar with this aspect of dyslexia, that it is characterized by difficulties with word reading and spelling. We'll talk a little bit more about why that is. And I think one of the more important pieces about it is that it is responsive to systematic treatment. So we do know how to provide supports to children who have dyslexia, children and adults who have dyslexia, so that they can acquire word reading skills and spelling skills. It is possible. And so the important part is to find it, to make sure that we've identified it, and then we can provide the services that are needed, because it does respond to treatment. So things that dyslexia is not. Dyslexia is not characterized or diagnosed by seeing letters backwards. So this continues to be a common myth, and it is not a visual or visually related issue. We won't have a chance to really get into a lot of the letter sound correspondence research tonight, but there is a lot of research talking about how children with dyslexia think about and learn orthographic information, and how that orthographic information can be beneficial to their learning. But I think that can be part of the misconception, is that there's an assumption that there's an issue with seeing letters backwards, and there can be an issue in learning letter sound patterns, but it is not because the letters are flipped. This is also not a diagnosis that we need to wait to until third grade to identify or apply. So we can identify children who have or who are exhibiting red flags for dyslexia very early. And in fact, one of the things that we'll talk about tonight is the fact that speech and language impairments can sometimes be red flags for dyslexia. And so we don't need to wait until third grade. We really shouldn't wait until third grade. And we absolutely want to get some information about how children have been taught to read. We absolutely want to make sure that we have given them time to go through reading instruction, but we can still have some supports in place as they go through reading instruction before we apply the diagnosis. And so we can do that as early as kindergarten to identify some of the red flags. We do see some of those red flags as early as preschool, because speech and language impairments exist in preschool. Dyslexia is not a visual problem, and so it's not related to how visual information is processed. And so as a result, anything related to different kinds of fonts, different sizes of fonts, different colored lenses, eye tracking exercises, any of those kinds of treatments are not going to be effective because it's not actually treating the root cause of the issue. So we'll talk a little bit more about what is the root cause of the issue. But I think importantly here, just to make sure that we are not thinking about this as a visual issue, and there have been some popular blog posts through non-scientific websites talking about how different fonts help people with dyslexia, and it is a possibility that a person with dyslexia maybe receives some sort of a boost from using a different kind of font, just because it is maybe, it's maybe just providing some sort of different stimuli that they're used to, but it's not actually fixing the dyslexia or alleviating the dyslexia in any way. So we really want to be careful when we see those kinds of recommendations. So dyslexia is a language-based word reading deficit. So the issue is not in the visual system, the issue is in the language system. And so that is why it's important that we think about speech and language impairments as they relate to dyslexia. So, and given that, and we know it's a language-based word reading deficit, so we need to kind of unpack that idea of what language is. So language is comprised of 5 different constructs. So we have phonology, morphology, semantics, syntax, and pragmatics. And depending on your background, you may be familiar with these 5 tenets of language, but I'll just provide a quick definition here for you. So phonology are the sounds in the language. Morphology are the smallest parts of language that carry meaning, such as the past tense ed that we see in verbs. So going from walk to walked, adding that ed at the end is a morpheme. We have semantics, which is vocabulary or word meaning. Syntax is the sentence structure. And pragmatics are the social use of language. And so all of these pieces work together. You know, we like to think about them as separate constructs, but they really do all work together to create a language system that is really, all of these pieces are synthesized together. And so it's nice to think about them as separate, but they are synthesized in our daily use. And so it's not really the case for those of us who are typically developing language users. You know, I don't really think about the difference between my phonology, the sounds in my language, versus my semantics versus my syntax. It's just all synthesized. And so that can make it difficult to identify and treat some of these aspects. In true 2020 fashion, I apologize, my dog is barking at the door, so I am just going to be right back in 1 second.
And thank you to everyone for your questions. We will answer those at the end. And we'll get the link for the handout to you on the Facebook page after tonight's presentation, for those of you that are asking. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Ziggy's here, so we're all set to go. Okay, so so these are the constructs of language. So what we're going to think about here is then how these constructs break down for different kinds of disorders. So you may be familiar with another kind of language disorder called developmental language disorder, or DLD. And we won't talk a lot about this tonight, but I do have some resources in the final slide at the end. And this, if you have an individual who has developmental language disorder, you can see any one or any combination of these language constructs that are impaired. And so all to a varying degree. So we might see issues specifically in morphology. We might see issues specific to semantics. We might see issues across all 5 areas of language. So if someone has a developmental language disorder, we still don't know a whole lot about what kind of language impairment they have until we do some assessment. So it can really span all 5 of these constructs, and all to varying degrees of severity. When we think about dyslexia, though, dyslexia is primarily an issue with phonology. And so the primary area of language that's impaired in individuals who have dyslexia is the area of phonology. Again, also to varying degrees. So as we've already talked about, there's a wide variety, there's kind of a spectrum that exists here. And then one of the populations that I most commonly study are kids who have speech sound disorders. And this is also a population of children who have difficulties in the area of phonology primarily. And so I will talk a little bit about children who have speech sound disorders and what we know about their access to reading. And so we'll think a little bit about kids who have dyslexia as well as kids who have speech sound disorders. So one of the really interesting and also kind of intriguing and maybe even frustrating parts about a diagnosis of dyslexia is that we can, even though we know that it primarily exists in the area of phonology for language, these children can also have difficulties across other areas of language. So, and even in the absence of having a developmental language disorder. So we can also see issues with morphology. And so morphology was the example that I gave was the ED that we add to the end of a word to make it past tense. And so an important thing to notice there is that even though that is a separate factor of language, a separate construct of language, when I change walk to walked, I'm adding a sound. So it also has a phonological piece to it. And so we can see some issues in morphology as a result of the overlap between morphology and phonology. And then the same is true for semantics. You know, we have words that sound the same. For a very, very basic example, you can take the words pat and bat, right? And so those only differ by a minor distinction between the first consonant in that word, the b and bat and the p and pat. And that minor distinction is a sound-based distinction. It's a phonological difference. And so that can also relate to some issues with semantics. And so you can kind of see here, we can see difficulties across other areas of language, really depending on the severity of the phonological deficit. Because as I mentioned, even though we really want to think about these 5 constructs as separate language constructs, they really are synthesized together, and they really do work together as a system. But we do also see co-occurrence of developmental language disorder and dyslexia. So even though we can see issues with other areas of language in children with dyslexia, and that might not be related to developmental language disorder, we can also see a comorbid diagnosis of dyslexia and developmental language disorder. And so you can see where this overlap can just be very confusing, because we have children who have dyslexia and don't have DLD, but they still have some issues with other areas of language. And so how do we determine those kids compared to kids who do have both diagnoses of dyslexia and DLD? And it's not an easy answer, but it is important that there's collaborative practice and that there's comprehensive assessments that take place. So we're going to go into a little bit more detail here about how language and reading are related. So one of the ways that we conceptualize this is through a theoretical framework called the simple view of reading. And this is one of the most commonly used frameworks within reading research. And it was developed in 1986 by Goff and Tumner. And the idea behind the simple view of reading is that reading is comprised of word recognition and listening comprehension. And so that in order to actually engage in the process of reading, which truly is reading comprehension, right? So you, in order to actually be reading, you have to be both decoding the words on the page, so looking at the letters in the words on the page and decoding them, and understanding what you're reading as you're reading it. And so the combination of those two skills is reading comprehension, and that is the goal. That is what we want all of our kids to be achieving. That's what we hope all adults in society have achieved as well. And so this framework is useful in thinking about the language underpinnings of reading. So this graphic may be familiar to many of you. This was developed by Hollis Scarborough and was originally published in the Handbook of Early Literacy Research. And this is called the Reading Rope. And this, I think I can maybe highlight something here. This graphic is another way of thinking about the simple view of reading. So the top part of the rope is the language comprehension or listening comprehension piece of the simple view of reading. And then you can see all of the factors that are constructs or skills that are underneath that language comprehension. And each one of those is associated with a different string or strand for that rope. And not one is necessarily any more important than another, but they do all work together to eventually get to the end of this rope, which is the skilled, fluent execution of reading. In the United States, we do anticipate that most of our kids are going to be there by 3rd grade, maybe 4th grade, maybe 2nd grade, kind of depending on the curriculum. But that is kind of a 3rd grade benchmark that we expect kids to be able to independently access the text, read the words on the page, and understand what they're reading and being able to process the text, infer information about it, and think critically about what they read. The bottom part is word recognition. So this is the second piece of the simple view of reading. And each one of these skills underneath it also is affiliated with one of the strings or strands that is woven into that rope. And again, most of these are language-based skills. Being able to, we'll talk a lot about phonological awareness tonight. So being able to understand and think about the sounds in words. And then pairing that with the written aspect of language. And so that's really decoding and sight word recognition really are related to written language. And so even though they may be less thought of as far as an oral language component, they certainly are the written aspect of language. And so all of the skills under language comprehension and all of the skills under word recognition are ultimately language skills. And so if you have a language impairment, in addition to or in the absence of dyslexia, reading is going to be challenging. If you have difficulties with speech sound production, we also know that the difficulty with producing certain speech sounds is often related to the phonological system. And so there's a disruption of some sort in the phonological system, which makes it difficult to produce certain speech sounds. Well, those speech sounds are the same ones that we use for reading, right? And so if you have a hard time, if you're producing W for R consistently, then your representation of that sound is distorted in some way. And it's a possibility that that distortion is going to impair your ability to read words that have that sound, and especially to spell words that have that sound. So your ability to map the sound to the letter and know that the letter we see when we see R makes the sound. That if you're not able to make that sound, it can be challenging to build up that representation and to remember that that's how you would spell a word like rabbit. And many kids that I've worked with who have difficulties with speech sound production would maybe even spell the word with a W at the beginning because they're sounding it out and saying wabbit. So when they're sounding it out, they're using their own phonological system to do that, and their phonological system is impaired. So we see this connection between speech and language in that way too. I think it's also really interesting to point out that reading and language skills are reciprocal in that the stronger that one gets, the stronger that another one gets. So we really do want kids to have strong language skills when they begin the process of learning how to read. Because that is going to really help them begin to develop those necessary literacy skills. So children who begin the process of reading with weaker language skills are at a bit of a disadvantage because they're not going to have the same access to vocabulary and some other print concept knowledge, identifying certain pictures in books, right? They're not going to have some of those skills that maybe a typically developing child might. And so we do really want those strong language skills at the beginning because that helps to develop reading skills. And then through the acquisition of reading skills, avenues to new and much more complex language begin to open up. And so as children are reading age-appropriate text, they're seeing more complex language. And so when we think about all of those 5 constructs of language we mentioned, and we have things like complex syntax and different kinds of clauses and prepositional phrases, you get exposure to that through reading most of the time, right? And so your ability to access new vocabulary, new syntactical structures, and really think deeply about language in ways that are higher level, like inferencing and predicting and making those kinds of guesses that we make when we're reading, that comes from having language skills to begin with. But also those language skills are bolstered by the access to reading. By continually reading developmentally appropriate text and age appropriate text, you're able to really acquire new language skills through the process of reading. So we need language to begin the process of reading, and we need reading to continue the process of language. And the same is true for a skill like phonological awareness, which we will talk a little bit more about here. So I won't go into the detail just quite yet of what phonological awareness is, because I have a slide for that in a minute, but in the same way that language and reading are reciprocal, we see that phonological awareness and word reading are also reciprocal. So as phonological awareness skills improve, so does word reading ability. And so then word reading ability then strengthens phonological awareness skills. And then that continues to further strengthen word reading ability. So it really is a cyclical process. It's not the case that we just, okay, I'm in first grade, I've acquired phonological awareness and I'm done. It is a continual process. And you can think about things even as an adult. I do have a good activity and example to show you how complex phonological awareness can be. But one thing that you can also think about is acquiring a second language. So anytime a person is acquiring a second language, that requires a new phonological, the establishment of new phonological representations. And that can be really challenging, regardless of how old you are, but particularly if you're an adult. And so as we discussed at the beginning, when we think about all these aspects of language, we know that phonology is the primary area, although certainly not the only area of language that is most impaired in dyslexia, but of course to varying degrees. And so what can happen over time as children with dyslexia, that maybe they haven't gotten a diagnosis, maybe they have gone under the radar and haven't really displayed very severe signs of dyslexia quite yet. Maybe they haven't received appropriate testing, or their school hasn't supported the kinds of testing that they need to identify it, or there's a variety of reasons that it could happen that a child hasn't received the services that they need. What can happen then is because they haven't received that diagnosis, or just because they have, even if they have the diagnosis, reading is hard. That's the characteristic. That is what dyslexia is, makes reading challenging. And so if reading is challenging, it's not something you want to do, right? I mean, that is a human response, right? So I can list, but I won't, all the things that I don't like to do because they're challenging for me, right? That's a natural human response to avoid something that's challenging. And so the issue then is if you avoid that challenging thing that happens to be reading, then you create a situation in which language can become less developed. It's not necessarily going to be impaired per se, but that can happen. But it's most certainly not going to be a robust language. Your language is not going to grow the way that it should be if you're not exposing yourself to reading and reading opportunities, which is understandable why children or individuals with dyslexia wouldn't want to do that, right? Because it's challenging. But as a result, it creates a situation where their language issue goes from being one of phonology to one of everything, right? Because they haven't seen enough vocabulary in order to get age-appropriate vocabulary skills. And they haven't heard enough complex syntax to be able to develop a robust syntactical system. And then we can even see issues with pragmatics. That's the social use of language, right? When you don't have the same vocabulary as your peers, then you're not able to keep up with conversations in the same way. And that can start to result in some pragmatic difficulties as well. So what started as a phonological issue can really bleed into a variety of issues with other areas of language. Okay, so as promised, here is some information about phonological awareness. So just to kind of reorient back to the reading rope, there are a variety of skills that are included in the skilled execution of reading. Phonological awareness is one of them. Again, not one of these, as you notice by the size of the strands, not one of these is more important than another necessarily. And we're going to talk about phonological awareness only because we are going to talk a little bit about kids who have speech sound disorders. And so that is one area of reading in particular that can be difficult for that population of children. So we're going to focus a little bit on phonological awareness here, which is one's sensitivity to the sound structure of a word. So we often measure this through tasks that tap into rhyming, blending, deletion, phoneme deletion. So some examples of that could be as simple as saying, tell me a word that rhymes with cat. Could be a blending task, could be I give you the phonemes and you tell me the word. So I say k, a, t, and you blend those sounds together to tell me cat. Or it could be a phoneme deletion task where I say cat without k, and you say at, right? So you've deleted that sound off of it and we get the remainder of the word. And we know that research supports a causal link between phonological awareness and early reading. And longitudinal studies have supported the importance of good phonological awareness as early as kindergarten to later reading. And it is a causal relationship. So, excuse me, phonological awareness does exist along a continuum. It is not a skill. So I mentioned, it's not the case that a child acquires phonological awareness in first grade. Pardon me. And then they're done. This is a skill that exists along a continuum. We do expect most of these skills that I'm going to present here to be acquired at a basic level by first grade. But then they continue to develop as language gets more complex through the process of reading. So as you encounter more multisyllabic words, as you encounter more words that don't have necessarily a transparent orthography, right? So there's all different kinds of ways that language gets more and more complex. So on this continuum, I have an arrow that's from easier to harder, but I almost kind of want to put quotes around easier because these are easier linguistically, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be easy for the kids that have dyslexia or the kids that you may be assessing or who are in your classroom. So we've got a skill, one of the easier skills is rhyming. And then we've got sentence segmentation. So kind of taking a sentence and breaking it up into its parts. And then syllable segmentation. So taking a word and breaking it up into its syllables. And then identification of initial or final phonemes. So being able to identify that cat and car start with the same sound. And then manipulation of individual phonemes. And an example of that would be something like the cat, delete from cat example that I gave earlier. And so these two boxes at the end that are blue, these two are phonemic awareness. And the difference between phonological awareness and phonemic awareness is phonological awareness is much more of an umbrella term, and it encompasses all of these skills you see here and several more. Phonemic awareness is really the manipulation of the individual sounds. So thinking about the first sound in the word or the last sound in the word, or blending the individual sounds together. So as you can kind of see, as this continuum goes from easier to harder, we're also going from larger linguistic units to smaller linguistic units. So we're going from words to syllables to sounds, right? And so that's an important distinction. And so then there's another PH word that we need to identify as well. So we've got phonological awareness and phonemic awareness and phonics. And so one way that I like to differentiate this is by thinking about phonological awareness tasks as ones you can do with your eyes shut. And so far we've talked about a few examples that are, I haven't been showing you any letters or, any print at all. So I've been saying k, at, cat, and just thinking about the sounds. And so you could do those tasks with your eyes shut because we're just thinking about the sounds, as opposed to phonics, in which your eyes should be open because we're typically referring to print. So our phonological awareness tasks are those in which our eyes are shut, and our phonics tasks are ones in which our eyes are open. So in phonics tasks, they're very similar as far as the actual structure of the task. So you still might be saying, what happens when I move this C off the beginning of the word cat and put an M there? Now what word do I have? So I went from k, at to at. Now what do I have, right? So you're actually doing a similar activity, but now you're including the letters. And that's a different kind of skill. It's not radically different, but it does, now that you're using the letters or the orthography, you're adding a level of possibly complexity, depending on the child. And you're also possibly providing a level of support. Some children actually really benefit from seeing the letters. And so phonics tasks may be easier compared to phonological awareness tasks, depending on how children perceive print. Okay, so this is an activity that I have for you. And I will just trust that you're kind of typing in the box to participate. And so in this activity, we'll go through each one of these 9 words. And for each word, we're going to segment just the sounds in the word. So you do have the print, but we're not actually thinking about the spelling at all. So we're not reversing the letters. We're going to reverse the sounds. So we're going to first segment the word into its sounds. And then we're going to take those sounds and say them backwards. And for each one of these examples, we should get a new real word. Okay, so in this first one, the word is teach. So if I segment that into its sounds, I have t, e, ch. And then if I reverse that, ch, e, t, and I get the word cheat. Okay, so we'll do the rest together. So we've got sigh, and if we break that down, we have s, I, and if you reverse it, I, s, ice. For cuts, you should get stuck. For speak, you should get keeps. For jab, you should get badge. For seen, you should get niece. For might, you should get time. For tax, you should get scat. So that's a tricky one. T, a, k, s, sk, at. And then for caught, you should get talk. And so I think that's a fun way to really kind of highlight, I've been using the example of the word cat. And if you are an adult and have had exposure to the English language and books and print, then cat is a very easy word to think about and manipulate. But this is a much more challenging skill. Not necessarily one I'd recommend working on in therapy. I don't know that it has that kind of relevance, but it is a helpful one to really show how complex it can be. So if you had a difficult time with this, imagine if your phonological system was impaired. And that's kind of mimicking the kinds of difficulties we might see in kids who have dyslexia. So I am going to quickly go through kids who have speech sound disorders. We're thinking about kids who have a delay in the acquisition of age-appropriate speech sounds. So kids should be able to say all speech sounds by the age of 6. So there should be no difficulties or distortions or errors on the production of speech sounds past the age of 6. And we know that if they do persist with those difficulties, they're definitely at risk for having reading difficulties. And indeed, about half of them exhibit that difficulty. And sometimes it lives in this idea of phonological awareness. That's the main skill that's impaired because their phonological system is impaired already because they're not producing speech sounds accurately. So we see this persist across ages. So we have research at the preschool level, and for our purposes and sake of time, I'm actually going to spin through this pretty quickly. We know that children who have difficulties producing speech in preschool have weak phonological awareness skills, and this is true even for kids who don't have comorbid language impairment. So even when just speech is impaired, they still have difficulties with phonological awareness. And that persists into school age. So we see difficulties with school age kids who have speech sound disorders and that have weak phonological awareness skills compared to their peers. This has been confirmed through MRIs that show cortical and subcortical differences during phonological processing tasks for kids who are a little bit older, 8.5 to 10. And then we also see this persist into adolescence, that children who have either residual or resolved speech sound disorders, resolved meaning they no longer exhibit the speech sound difference or difficulty, but they still have issues with phonological awareness tasks similar to the one that you just did. So a few early warning signs to be mindful of. Any sort of family history of language or reading impairment is an early warning sign of dyslexia. Delayed language can be an early warning sign, maybe of dyslexia, but also maybe of another kind of reading impairment. So we do expect kids by the age of 24 months, to have 50 words and or be at the onset of combining 2 words together. And so, if they don't have quite 50 words yet, but they've started combining words, that's good. But, if neither one of these milestones have been met, that's considered a language delay. So that's early, right? So that's not quite 2 years old. That's a red flag. We want to be mindful of that. Similarly, difficulty producing many speech sounds, or if a child is particularly hard to understand, that can be a red flag. Again, for both of these, both the late talkers, the delayed language, and the difficulty with speech production that early on, both of those issues can resolve without any further academic or reading related outcomes. But we do know that these are red flags as well. So it's not a guarantee that there's going to be issues with reading, but it is definitely a red flag we want to be mindful of. We want to watch those kids. And then also difficulty learning letter names and sounds. So we see that really pretty early, depending, but certainly by preschool, if they're having a hard time learning letter names and letter sounds, that's definitely an early warning sign. So some conclusions before I turn it over for you guys, if you have some questions. Speech and language skills serve as critical and foundational skills for later reading success. And early difficulties with speech and language can be red flags for later reading difficulties, including dyslexia. And educational professionals, including speech and language pathologists, should be trained in the science of reading, which is related to the simple view of reading that you heard about earlier tonight, to really best support the connections between speech, language, and literacy. So the next few slides are just some resources. The first one are some links for dyslexia resources or reading resources. You're probably already familiar with the Decoding Dyslexia Florida website if you're here, but there's a few other websites, including the Florida Center for Reading Research, which does just absolutely fantastic work helping to move the science of reading forward and help children achieve reading success. There are a few resources here for developmental language disorder, which we mentioned at the beginning. In fact, Friday of this week is Developmental Language Disorder Awareness Day. And so that effort is led by the folks at dldandme.org and Rattled. And so there are lots of resources here for you to check out, including some podcasts. And then just a few websites that provide access to online children's books. I know right now in the era of COVID, access to print and books can be challenging, depending on if your libraries are open or if you feel comfortable going to them. So these are all a variety of online children's books, and all of these are in the handout. So here is, again, my contact information that I presented at the beginning. My lab website is there. So it's http://classlab.cci.fsu.edu. If you click on the resources tab, you'll find the handout for tonight. And then I'm available through a variety of media. So Joy, I'm going to turn it back to you to see if there are some questions I can answer.
Yes, we actually have quite a few questions. So let us know when it's time for us to wrap up. But let's see, we had some questions about some comorbidities associated with dyslexia. So one of the questions was, is there a correlation with ADHD and dyslexia?
That's a great question. I don't know that there's a correlation, but there certainly are children who present with both. There is great research by Sean Redmond, Redmond, and I would recommend looking up his work. He has looked into the relationships between dyslexia and ADHD and DLD, developmental language disorder. So there is definitely some overlap. I don't know if there's any sort of causal relationships, but those two can absolutely co-occur.
Thank you. And then there was some discussion about apraxia and dyslexia. Any connection?
Yes. So apraxia is also a speech sound disorder. It's a type of speech sound disorder that's more motoric in nature. And so there can be some difficulties in reading in individuals who have apraxia. Again, even though it's not a phonologically based disorder, because it is much more motoric in nature, but we can see some overlap because at the same time, even though it's not the phonological system, there's still difficulty producing the speech sounds necessary. And so that can create some difficulties with establishing and storing those representations, those mental representations necessary for decoding and spelling. So there definitely can be a connection. There is some research that you can look into. So Tiffany Hogan has done some research on the connections between childhood apraxia of speech and dyslexia. Jenny Zuck, who's at Boston University, Jenya Ayuzini-Siegel, who's at Marquette University. Those are some great researchers to look up for the connection or apraxia and or the connection between apraxia and dyslexia.
There was a question about RAN, or rapid automatic naming, and asking if that's a construct of phonological or phonemic awareness.
That's a great question. No, not really, but it is a construct that does tend to stand alone. Most statistical models will find RAN is a construct that is separate from phonological awareness in a way that there's the double deficit model that you've maybe heard of, or that's one thing that you can look up. So that is from Marianne Wolf. And that double deficit model suggests that when both RAN and phonological awareness are impaired, a child with dyslexia is likely to be much more severe. And so through that model, they've suggested that there's kind of two types of dyslexia, or you may have also seen the conversations about multiple types of dyslexia, but that one in which RAN is impaired. And so I'll talk about what RAN is in a second, but one in which RAN is impaired and one in which phonological awareness is impaired. And when RAN alone is impaired, you see more issues with reading fluency. And so those are children who can maybe better acquire the letter sound relationships, but have a hard time with reading fluency. And then when PA is impaired, that's when you really see phonological awareness. That's when you really see the issues with the letter sound correspondence, and maybe not as much with fluency. But then when both are impaired, that's the double deficit. And then there's issues with both accessing the print and fluently reading it. And so that is a standalone construct. So just in case there are people who don't know what RAN is, this is rapid automatic naming, and it's typically tested. There's a variety of ways to do it, but it's typically tested by showing a kid a bunch of images on a matrix. So maybe like 6 by 6 images, and the images could be just everyday items like a key, a house, a car, a tree, or they could be different colored shapes. And so a blue square, a red triangle, a green heart. And so the child has to go through that matrix and as quickly as possible name these randomly ordered items. And so house, tree, car, cat, car, tree, house, right? As fast as they possibly can. And then a score is computed based on how long it takes them to name all those things. And so that's called rapid automatic naming. And it is shown to be related to reading success. And we actually just have a paper that we're submitting this week looking at kids with speech sound disorders. And I can't give the full details just because of the data hasn't been published yet, but we are finding that RAN is really a unique predictor within kids who have speech sound disorders. So there's something there with respect to the ability to produce the speech accurately and to work through a RAN task. Yeah.
Interesting. There's a question asking, why are students being tested using verbal IQ test when there's a language deficit?
Excellent question. I wish I knew the answer. There are a lot of systemic issues with assessment and diagnosis of dyslexia, and that's one of them. And you've really hit the nail on the head with the primary problem, that, where there's no way to tease apart that cognitive intelligence or IQ and language. And so if language is impaired, they're going to be at a disadvantage. The same is true for IQ tests that require word reading. If they're looking at word reading, and they're calling that a measure of IQ, and a child has dyslexia, it's going to look as though their IQ is lower because you're asking them to do the thing that they can't do. And so we do typically recommend a nonverbal IQ test. So there are a few subtests. The Kaufman Brief Intelligence Test has a few subtests that we use that are nonverbal. The Reynolds Intellectual Assessment Scales has another couple of assessments. And so it's much better to use a nonverbal IQ test. As far as answering the question as to why that's done, I'd love to work with you on finding that answer.
There's another question asking, can dyslexia coexist with a mild intellectual disability where IQ is said to be 67?
That's a good question. It's really tricky to answer because there's a lot that we don't really know about those kind of cut points of on intelligence tests. So whether it's verbal or nonverbal, there's a lot we don't know. If that IQ test that you're measuring was a verbal IQ test, and depending on which subtests were given, I would question the validity of that score. So it's obviously a very low score of 67. So here we're kind of thinking about the bell curve where the mean is 100 and an average range would be 85 to 115. So a score of 67 is going to be really low. Can they co-occur? Yes, but I would question if the reading deficit is actually related to the cognitive deficit, or if it is something separate and it's two comorbid disorders. And I think there's a lot we need to learn about that population.
Definitely. There was a question about autism and dyslexia. Can they coexist? And how would a conversation like this be similar or different for children with autism?
Well, I hate to break it to you, but you are asking the wrong person. I know very little about autism, so I really don't know the answer to that one.
Thank you. How about, we get several questions about how can I get my child diagnosed with dyslexia?
Yes. So this is a state-specific issue. Did my screen just go blank? I did not mean to do that. This is a state-specific issue. So there's different requirements at each state. And schools, so if your child's in a public school, then they adhere to the state guidelines, and those vary so widely. So, we're coming to you from Florida, but I moved here from Massachusetts, and so and have lived in several other states as well. And there's just the variety of state guidelines is just so wildly different. So it is going to depend on the state that you're in. I'll assume you're in Florida just because of the context of tonight, but if you're in a public school, you can write a letter to the director of special education and request that your child is tested. It may not be the case that they end up with a dyslexia diagnosis, because their policy still may be to not use the term dyslexia. And that is a state legislative issue that Joy and I are part of a team of people who are working really hard to change, so that we do have the term dyslexia as one of the possible eligibility categories that can be chosen. It's not an option right now. So it's not really used on IEPs because it's not something that's even an option on an IEP. So we are kind of stuck in the specific reading disability world. But you can request in the letter that that your child is tested for looking at phonological awareness, looking at word reading, and then we also like to include measures of non-word reading. And so if you email me, my email is here on the screen. I'm happy to say all this again differently to help you. But those measures are going to give you this idea of phonological awareness we've talked about tonight. And then also, looking at non-word versus real word reading is going to help to see really what their letter sound correspondence skills are, and really how they approach reading a new word. Reading real words is a skill, right? So words that are real in the English language, of course, it's a skill, but we also don't know if they're reading them or if they've just seen them a lot, so they've memorized them, and so they're using their memory. Whereas a non-word reading task, they're novel items. There's no way they could possibly have seen them before or memorized them, and so that gives us a better picture. So requesting that kind of trio of tests is going to be helpful, including a nonverbal IQ test would be helpful. That's not going to rule out or confirm dyslexia, of course, but it's just going to be maybe a helpful score for you. And if it's in writing, the school is required to do it. So again, that's not necessarily going to end up with a dyslexia diagnosis per se, but you will get information that could be that could at least get accommodations or an IEP. That would be my recommendation.
There was a question on your thoughts about the difference between continuous blending and segmented blending.
So do you mean like when actually pausing, like at, as opposed to doing that a little bit more fluently? Sorry, I know it's not helpful when I ask a question back, but.
Yeah, so if our viewer wants to clarify, that may be what they're meaning. I was thinking maybe on the actual sounds, like using continuing sounds when they're working on blending, maybe in the beginning.
Yeah.
Could you speak to either of those?
Sure. Well, yeah. So I'll just here are my thoughts of just thinking about those things. Is that the longer in between each sound, the more difficult it's going to be, right? So if I say k, a, I've just created a really complex task for you, right? Because not only are you going to have to try and blend those together, there's like an epic of time in between each one of those sounds, right? And so, especially if you have an impaired phonological system, because another thing we see that's impaired in kids with dyslexia or other phonological deficits is their working memory. And so that's a working memory task where I'm asking you to think about these sounds and then manipulate them in some way. So you have to keep them active in your working memory in order to, complete that task and say the word back. And so if it's separated like that, it can be more challenging, which in my opinion can actually be more meaningful. If you're blending them, kind of smoothing them together, it's a less complex task. And the other thing I'd caution is just to make sure that you're not adding any vowels. So instead of k, saying k, right? So the sound is not k, the sound is k, right? So there's no vowel, it's just a consonant, k. And so if there's this kind of transition that's applied, we don't want to add additional vowels so that the child is saying ka-ata, right? Because you told them say ka-a-ta, right? And so then they say ka-ata and they're right, by the way. If that's what you give them and they blend it that way, they're right. So that would be my only caution, is to just not add any vowels, but to just be aware of the complexity of what you're asking the kid to do.
Advice. So many questions. I'm so sorry if we don't get to your questions tonight. How early to begin phonological awareness? Is preschool appropriate?
Preschool is appropriate, yes. So I think along that phonological awareness continuum, the phonemic awareness piece is going to be a little bit more challenging. And I think you have to kind of meet the kid where they are. So, if they aren't quite able to rhyme yet, they should, a lot of typically developing 3-year-olds understand the concept of rhyme and can rhyme. And so that's definitely something that's appropriate to work on at, around preschool, 3 and 4 years old. It doesn't mean they're delayed if they can't do it at 3, right? But it's absolutely something that's appropriate to work on. It is a preschool skill to be able to rhyme and to think about how words sound the same. You might see some preschoolers who also have the sensitivity to initial sounds, particularly the sound that starts their first name. So, Tyler has his T, and if he hears the word tiger, then he might think, oh, that starts with my sound. That's my sound, right? So they start to have this awareness, and of course it's all about them, right? Because it's their sound. But it's still this awareness of how sounds are similar. So yeah, it's absolutely appropriate to work on that in preschool. I'd say along that continuum that I showed, we expect those kids to have those skills pretty solid by 1st grade. So, anytime before then, I'd say like preschool through 1st grade, we really are focusing on that skill. But then I'm also going to just turn and quickly say, even though no one asked yet, that it's never too late to work on phonological awareness either. So if you've got a kid who's an 8th grader or 10th grader who maybe hadn't been identified until recently, and that happens, as you may know, those are skills they might not have yet, right? And so of course you need to adapt how you approach teaching rhyming and phoneme blending to a 10th grader, right? It has to be age appropriate, and I love to use curriculum words. So I just look in their science books and find words that I can, segment into syllables and sounds, like, photosynthesis. Those are great words to use to think about, breaking words up into their syllables, and it would be a real killer of a blending task. But, it's more age appropriate, right? And so you can have them pick the words and then you can work through it. So I'd say preschool is a good time to start, but it's never too late either.
Such a good reminder. For parents, what can parents do to help their dyslexic children?
Mm. I think, there's so many things. I think first, just knowing that you didn't do anything wrong. And I think that is the most important thing that you can internalize, because that's going to change how you perceive what your child is experiencing. And I know it's common for parents to think that it's their fault, that they did something wrong, that, what if they could have seen something sooner or earlier, and you didn't, you couldn't, and you did everything right along the way. And so internalizing that and knowing that you have your child's best interest at heart is truly one of the best things you can do, because your relationship with your child is going to improve as a result, and your relationship with the people who are working to help your child is also going to improve, because this is not about anything that you did or could have done differently. So I think that's probably the number one thing I'd say. In addition, there are, reading to your kids, from very early on is super helpful. And then once they get to a point where maybe they're less interested in having you read to them, I love the idea of audiobooks and having kids, have the book in front of them. So even something as dense and complex as Harry Potter, they have the book in front of them and they're listening to it. So if they can't access the text on their own, that doesn't mean that there isn't a way to do that. And so they can listen to the book and look at the print. So they're getting this, they're getting the experience of being read to without it being, maybe they're not, they're too old for that or whatever, but they're still getting the experience because they're hearing the production of the words. And so they're getting that phonology, but they're seeing the letters and the sounds and kind of getting that mapping going. So I think that's another great way. And most public libraries have access to something akin to the Libby app. So in my library, if you have a public library card, which is free, our library has a Libby account, and a lot of libraries have something similar where you can get free audiobooks. And so it shouldn't be an additional cost to do that as well. So, and even if they don't have the print book in front of them, really just listening to the book is still going to give them the experience of getting the vocabulary and the syntax, the narrative structure, thinking, doing some predicting and inferencing skills. I think that's a great gift, is to just, give them access to stories and to books through audiobooks.
Now
I can probably do one more question, Joy, if you want.
Okay, last one for the educators out there.
Yeah.
What can they do? And there's definitely some angst in the chat box about why are we not doing more right now? So how can we start as educators?
Yeah. That's a great question. And also same goes for you, is that, our training programs need to do a better job of embedding the science of reading into training programs. And so if this is information that you don't know as an educator, it's not your fault, right? But again, it's never too late to learn. And so I think, you're taking the first step by attending a webinar like this and learning a little bit more about it. Working with other professionals in your building. So talking to the speech language pathologist. It doesn't mean that all of these kids need to be in speech therapy. So for my SLP friends, that does not mean that all of these kids need to be in speech therapy, but speech pathologists are experts in phonology, period. And so it could be just, the speech pathologist could be a good resource for you and learning a little bit more about phonology and how it relates to speech production and reading and spelling. The reading specialist at your school should be a good resource as well. And so I think really, attending webinars like this, reading some of the research behind the science of reading. I do have a few resources. So when you go to my website and go to the resources tab, I do have a few other podcast episodes you can listen to. I have another webinar that's free that goes into a little bit more detail about speech, sounds, and literacy. It's some of what you saw tonight, but a little bit more detail. So there are some resources there. And I think just encouraging the kids that you're working with to to continue to try, because this can become very quickly, they can kind of spiral into having some behavior issues in the classroom, because you're asking them to do the one thing that is really, really hard for them. And that can start to manifest in behavioral outbursts and challenges with engaging in the class material. And so viewing those behaviors as calls for help is another really important thing to do at this stage, is to really just see that for what it is, and to try and help those kids in some way, even if it will be frustrating on your end. Those are a few like tomorrow activities that you could do.
Well, thank you so much. And those of you that we didn't get to your questions, you've got Dr. Farquharson's contact information. So please feel free to send those in, or engage with us on the Decoding Dyslexia Florida page. Thank you so much for attending. Dr. Farquharson, we are so grateful for you. This was awesome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was great to be here.
Thank you guys. Have a great night, and we'll be back soon, I'm sure, with another discussion. Take care.